And I think these two very promising initiatives they had, it would be super important to cater them further, because also how many European Union politicians regularly come into exchange with adult learners from whatever background.
Across Europe, many organisations are working in education to create spaces where people can share their experiences and concerns. Yet the link between these everyday experiences and the decisions made at policy level is not always clear. Understanding how this connection is built and what helps or limits it is an important part of strengthening participation in adult learning. To explore this, I'm joined by Georg Pirker from the DARA Network, an organisation active in citizenship and human rights education. Georg offers a practical view of how learning environments can support participation, how civil society helps carry learner perspectives into policy discussions, and what conditions make these processes more meaningful. This is the Enhance podcast, a series which focuses on learner voice, participation and inclusion in adult education. I'm Aoife, Communications Officer at Solidar. This series is part of the Enhance project, a project co-funded by the European Union, which works to support democratic practices in education and to strengthen the role of learners in shaping their learning environments. Here's my conversation with Georg. Well, thank you for joining me today. And maybe to start, I can hand over to you and ask you to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Georg Pirker. I'm here today for the DARE Network, which is Democracy and Human Rights Education in Europe. It's an NGO which is active in citizenship education in all educational fields, formal, non-formal education, but also in the different sectors comprising from the youth to adult learning to higher education. We try to facilitate on one hand a bit the discussion among the different members about this big question of what makes good education, what makes good citizenship education, what makes good human rights education. And there is ultimately, of course, always this connection to, we are a European network that focuses European policies, policy making as one of the, let's say, key fields where also adult learning rotates around, since in a lot of countries there is not such strongly established individual systems of adult learning, but they are a bit dispersed to various sectors. DARE itself is a small organization because we are run more or less voluntary by different member organizations. So they form an association. It has an elected board and it has some people, me and a colleague currently, we are based in Germany, who run a bit like the office of the network in the background, but it's very members driven.
Great, thank you. So the Enhance project explores how to integrate and centre the learner voice in policymaking. In your view, what are some of the ways that policymakers can work with civil society to involve civil society in participatory processes and to ensure that learner voices, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, are heard in policymaking?
I think it affects different levels of, let's say, policymaking and education, because on the one hand, if we think from the level of the learners is really people that are like locally in any learning environments, be it like further education and training, be it like free adult learning opportunities in the different structures, like Nordic countries a bit more structured, in South probably connected to universities or to popular education. And the one important finding I see is that often it's local policy making, which is also responsible like for the setup of organizations, for support, for kind of supporting like the setup of premises. And then you have the local or national policies on adult learning, very often like related to sometimes not the core of, let's say, of classical Grundtvig oriented learning, but also like the wider field, as it's like in this so-called German system of Volkshochschulen, where you have like further education, where you have job-related training, where you have the different fields. And one key feature in the field of citizenship is really kind of bringing these local realities of people somehow also to policy making where it affects them. And then we see very different approaches from learning cycles as we have them like in Scandinavian countries or in the Nordic, to community work of organizations that work with in specific neighborhoods or in districts where people are like kind of facing certain challenges. Often, of course, it's economic challenges, it's financial challenges, resulting in a lot of, let's say, intersectional difficulties. And of course, I think it's nothing new when it's about political representation. Often the people who represent, the higher you go to the national, to the European level, are often also from their, let's say, work background, job profiles, what they do, they are not the average learner. Some still are. I remember like there's also in the European Parliament have been always kind of some people that also came from the adult learning field in a certain way, but I would say the local level is quite connected to the challenges. Also the support of empowerment, providing spaces as such, I think is super important. Yeah. And because people often don't have the spaces to where they can interact, where they can define the problem, where they can define the challenge, where they can approach like a solution. And then often this role of people in this educational fields or of these educational providers is also to somehow connect to the representative, be it like the municipal representative or be it like kind of someone who can influence, someone who can take a decision. And I think this is a bit interesting since it's not classical education, because it's also connecting in a certain way and taking up things, which is, I think, much more like this community-related work.
Thank you so much. So there, I think you touched on a lot of examples from the local and the national level. Could you tell us a bit more about how we can ensure that the learner voice is represented at the EU level?
There's also the classical civic education field where you work on certain topics that affect society, themes, issues, climate change, employment, that have a huge political connection, and where then is also like the, let's say, the bigger frames of European educational policies, of European employment policies, of European transformation policies affected, if we look at digitalization or things like this. But often it's, I think, for the individual learners to really make the way to the European policy makers is a challenge. On the other hand, I see in a lot of programs of education or educational providers in the adult field is this classical thing, trip to Brussels, where you meet your local representative in the parliament, where you can talk to, where you get to learn about European institutions. And this is also not to underestimate, because it's also like kind of a way which brings the average people's issues like also to the policy level. And if it's just kind of seeing what that means working in Brussels, seeing what that means being a politician or so, it's not to underestimate. I think it can also have a quite empowering factor for people that, let's say, face a lot of exclusion or that are like in vulnerable conditions. So it's like to see, okay, we can, with the help of kind of an educational organization or any adult learning provider, we can make it, because there are these organized, let's say, trips, travels, which also like often work in this field of civics somehow. It's kind of approaching democracy issues. And I think they are quite common and should not be underestimated. It's not only visits and visitors or kind of the voters of the parliamentarian, but the simple people that can go there. And this is a thing that is, it's often not so much connected to the core European learning and education and training policies and adult learning policies, but it's a very important moment for people to understand or to somehow participate in that. I think this is the two main issues. If it's about like really kind of influencing policy making, coming into exchange with, let's say, with stakeholders on the European political level or on the national political level as learner representatives, there is this huge challenge as how to involve learners in governing structures of educational organizations.
And would you have a specific example in mind of how to involve learners in the governing structures of educational organizations?
My example would be from the youth field, where we have the Council of Europe Quality Label Youth Centers. It's kind of a specific EACEA learning structure for education for democratic citizenship and human rights, where youth centers that are also like doing non-formal educational programs and so on undergo a quality label procedure with the Council of Europe. And one of the award criteria is to have young people represented in the governing board of the educational organizations. So to have learners' voice, because also young people are learners, in the steering constituencies of the organizations that are responsible for learning. And I think also like in several adult learning fields, we have these learners' councils or learners' representatives. However, I think it can be quite a challenge to, let's say, you become from a simple language class attendant or course attendant, like to make that way into becoming kind of seeing the sense in contributing to a learner's board or in these constituencies. I think it's not so easy since applies a lot of time, but also applies a lot of understanding why it's important to involve these people, which goes far beyond, let's say, the pedagogy, like following learners' interests, putting their experiences at heart. With the political thing, I think it is crucial importance that there are like organizations who in a certain way also represent the experience of the learning fields, including the learners. Because specifically, let's say, adult learning policy, education and training policies in European levels, they are complex. And to know where to put the screwdriver or where it makes sense to lobby up and do things is even for people like you in Solidar or us in their lifelong learning platform, it requires a lot of efforts and standing and being informed, being up to date, knowing at what moment to enter processes and dialogues. And I see like these organizations somehow also crucial, like for also having a certain advocacy for learners. They are somehow intermediaries, to my understanding.
So you mentioned there the challenges associated with involving learners in policymaking processes, and particular at the EU level. Could you expand a bit on what these challenges are and how civil society can work with policymakers to overcome them and to support learners to be meaningfully engaged in policymaking?
Well, I mean, the one thing is to have really kind of a steady commitment to involvement in consultations. I think kind of an example that I can provide is, again, rather from the youth field, is the youth dialogues, European youth dialogues, where you have like kind of these structured interaction between young people via kind of half a year connected to the priorities of the council presidencies, focusing to the youth goals and having a very, very structured involvement and policy process following up on issues that matter for young people. But young people are also adult, because if we look into youth field, for example, 18 onwards, 27, it's young adults. And I think there we can see quite a good example of how you can channelize young people's or people's issues into kind of feeding into the European Union policy process. Also this vision to work on this, let's say, to have the learners somehow peering up. And I think from this youth dialogue processes, there is quite a good example how this can be set up also to very complex questions of policy making, and where the European Union Commission is also held accountable, like for demands for issues that come up from the people that participate in it. And the other challenge is a bit representativity, in how far kind of single voices are kind of representative. Often we have like, I see we have often better Eurostat data than direct involvement of people. But then it needs people and organizations who are capable to work with the data on adult learning provided on issues like life circumstances of people, and that can transmit this into policy process. This is for me like kind of a bit of a bridging tool, and therefore civil society organizations are obviously needed, because you do not have them like, let's say, in of course there's like educational science, there's like kind of adult learning science and research in certain fields, but you need to have organizations that are able to transmit and also like to break it down to ground realities, and on the other hand connected to the policy level. Often it's can be quite easy things, and a change in European vet law adoption can have huge impact on huge learning fields in the adult learning sectors, because some things are kind of not so much subsidized anymore from the local context, or are taxed different and so on. I mean, the effect on learners is quite different then, And therefore you need civil society organizations that have the feet on the ground and the head in the policy process somewhere. And then we have often a very, let's say, job market related view of policy making, kind of what adult learning needs to serve first. But specifically from the field where I would say like democratic involvement of young people, it needs to be taken deadly serious. Young adult people who go voting, and given the challenges we face in all of our European societies, in our democratic constituency, and even in the European Parliament, it's voters who vote. And I'm deeply convinced that there is kind of a strong stand to make for as many as possible democratic learning opportunities for adults in a lifetime approach. People should be supported, that people can interact together about political issues, that they can ask questions, that they can define political interests, and that they are subjects of political processes in a certain way. And this is not only like kind of to skill someone up with the next competency or something like this, but it's kind of a ground provision and a crucial importance. And I think specifically if we see like European policy development, adult learning policy development, we have a lot of key transitions like digitalization, we have climate catastrophe, we have the deep social question of inequality in education, of access to education, of access to, let's say, decent life conditions, which are deeply related and deeply serious policy questions that need to be discussed by people also. And I think therefore adult learning plays a crucial role. I see like I think on the political level, there's quite a strong commitment, but I think it means really kind of to also take a responsibility to roll out structures and to take the difficulty to create access conditions for a learner to the policy level as a serious issue. And I think without kind of having this transmitting function of NGOs that can channelize the needs, the problems, but also the difficulties arising for policy making, specifically in the citizenship and democracy field, is crucial. And I fear a bit at the moment that kind of with this also anti-NGO campaign we have from parts of the parliament, and so that it's actually kind of absolutely counterproductive to what is actually needed for European policy development. Yeah.
We wholeheartedly agree, of course. And you mentioned a bit there about the link between education and particularly citizenship education and people's ability to engage in policymaking and the democratic process in general. Could you go a little bit deeper into this?
Well, what I see is like kind of, for me, is like this deep and very clear connection between like education, learning and participation or democratic participation. And I think on the one hand, looking into the pedagogical work and into the working field, the basic condition is like kind of to, that's all these buzzwords like learner-centeredness, but taking that seriously, also understanding that kind of the learning environment is probably something unique. You can create a situation where people pursue their certain interests and they are not only informed, but they participate in this process, and thus they develop a certain openness to, let's say, diversity of opinions, to a diversity of situations. And I'm once a week attending an adult learning language course. So it's one of the most thrilling moments in every week is when we meet, and all of the people there, they have totally different backgrounds. They work in different fields. Some of them don't work. Some of them are studying. Some of them are really in quite, let's say, important positions. But there they are all equal. And they pursue a common interest. And although the common interest is language learning, there is a lot of other things negotiated, like within the communication, within the topics, how we deal. And so, I think this speaks a bit also like for this, what people do if they are more like in the civics field in adult learning. It's really kind of creating this conditions to explore issues in all their difficulties, but all with all the multiple experiences and perspectives people bring in. And this is often a very unique experience for people, because in everyday life, a social environment and whatever, people do not really make this experience. And it's like kind of a contradiction also. And it's also a bit of like how things can be. To experience this is an empowerment itself. Yeah. And I see Also, I see a lot of adult learning providers who really became also catering an agent or agents of issues that matter for people on the local level, like kind of what does that mean if we have no park, or if we just have kind of a shitty public sphere outside in our district and whatever, and then there's someone who starts taking care by facilitating a dialogue, by kind of bringing the people together, by visiting with them stakeholders, by kind of running common activities, and there's a lot of action connected to it. People take initiatives, and often they also become politically active. They make that kind of from addressing an issue where they experience, like in a course, that they are not just informed and taught, but they are taken seriously. They get their agency for these issues and for their own issues, and such they organize. And I think this is a very important field, because if it's about democracy, is the most important experiences you make and you gain as a person is on issues that affect you in your direct environment, on community level, in your local district, on city or whatever. If you see kind of you engage, and somehow there's a reward because things are being catered or are kind of discussed then also politically, then you can see that your voice matters. And this I take very serious. Yeah. And of course, in the more general the politics get, and the more complex they get, the more abstract it becomes for people. But it does not mean that it's distant from everyday life experiences. If I think, for example, about, let's say, regulation of digital transformation issues, the only entity who can really kind of successfully regulate is the European Union, and means kind of what regulations the European Union does has a direct impact on your personal digital, let's say, environment, safety, rights, and whatever. And there is a field where this very, very abstract European policy making is quite close to people's issues. But let's say the magic would be like in adult education, like to make this connection to that policy field that can make the difference. And so for me, it's like kind of this participative environment of adult learning, and this approach to work with people, not only like kind of ex cathedra, but like to cater their needs to see where they are and take them from where they are. This is one of the core capacity of adult learners and of adult learning organizations. Yeah.
So staying a little bit at the EU level, do you see anything specifically in place at EU level at the moment, or anything more that could be done in order to support member states and civil society in the member states to create participatory processes that include learner voices?
I think there's several things. I think for me quite interesting, if you think, like you asked before, how about like vulnerable groups, how about people facing having difficulties in accessing whatever, be it social rights, being like their participation rights, or whatever, simple people that are more challenged in communities. Adult learning has a huge role, if I think like right now, of the basic skills action plan, including citizenship as a basic skill, which is of course something different than reading, writing, but it asks like certain capacities as capacities that are important even before you start like developing lifelong learning competences and whatever, because they are so basic and so important. Yeah, and it for me it's quite interesting to see that citizenship has made it into that field. Of course, it needs to be negotiated right now what that means. At the moment, it has more focus on school, but I see like a huge effort, like, and a huge door open also to a lot of these, how to say, like kind of to these core adult learning policies, like second chance upskilling policies, how is it, literacy policies, all these things that start, or that provide, let's say, for people equal starting conditions into society, into accessing debates, into accessing rights. And I think for a long time we have been quite unaware about that. With the citizenship skill is of course specifically interesting, because we could also say, okay, what does it mean, like 40, 50, sometimes even more % of people voting for undemocratic parties, and they are not only like, sometimes it's highly literate people in a certain way, where you would say they have a lot of competencies. Yeah, but what does that mean, kind of in relation to citizenship skills? Yeah, it's definitely something somehow different to measure and interpret than if someone is functional illiterate. Yeah, but on the other hand, putting basic democratic participation skills and appreciating, let's say, democratic decision finding and defending that as a skill. Of course, we are only at the beginning of a very interesting discussion that needs to be led everywhere. Yeah. So this action plan for me provides, I think, a lot of brain food and thought food also, and how to set up structures, how to set up pedagogy, but also arising from that, what that actually means for a wider understanding of learning in a lifelong way, which is not only like testing in a curricular way, like in schools or whatever. And I think there might be also a lot of connection to the VET field, vocational education training. We have a lot of companies in a lot of countries for whom it is of a huge matter in how far, let's say, democratic participation in the company does not only apply to labor rights, but also like means, what does that mean if we have kind of a very, very diverse and heterogeneous multinational group of workers? Yeah. What does that mean if there is kind of increasing racism coming up, increasing like change of, let's say, hostile mindsets of people? What does that mean about the capacity within our organization or company to work together? And so I see a lot of efforts to also work on that, where adult learning experience is needed, where citizenship education experience is needed. And for me, it becomes, on the one hand, it becomes a transversal task in a certain way, which is then interesting for us on the European level or for the NGOs working on it. On the other hand, we should pay attention that it, because of becoming a transversal task, does not get lost. So, because then it's everywhere and it becomes very blurry. So here I see a huge and important task also for organizations like you as Lifelong Learning Platform, EAEA, to really think that what that means like on the ground, but also what that means for holding a policy process accountable in a certain way. And at the moment we are, I think, at a bit of a crucial moment when it's about negotiating the new financial framework and all these things, and seeing like there's a lot of, let's say, also policy aims connected to it. And then if it's about, and if these policies should contribute to, let's say, resilient, safe societies, definitely there's a lot of questions and a lot of issues to be discussed and to be negotiated also for the field, which is adult learning. And there I see a lot of very important work we need still to do ahead of us.
Then to finish up and to reflect back, can you share an example of a policy process in which the learner voice had significant influence on the outcome? Or if you have multiple examples, we'd also be happy to hear them.
But I think for one of the really good examples for me is really the older Grundtvig program, where on one time was also the prison education, which was kind of a study-based and research-based decision of the European Commission to invest part of the Grundtvig program money into prison education, which had a huge impact all over Europe on a target group and on a group of people that were really, let's say, a bit not on the radar, or were always like kind of in this very, very prejudices affected groups of people and learners, because once in prison, you are always ex-prisoner. And what does that mean if you kind of create in prison a path for life stability and things like this? Yeah. And there's a lot of super interesting pedagogy being developed, also like theater pedagogy, but also like kind of what does election mean in prison and things like this. Yeah. How can prisoners participate in democratic elections? And there was a lot of very, very cool and promising programs and activities, which unfortunately went away since it was not so much focus anymore in the current Erasmus program. That it's just you can do, but there is not a specific policy focus, of course. Yeah, and I think this is sometimes a bit the good thing to see. If you make an issue on the European level on a specific field, then the European Commission, or with the help of the European programs, are really able to make a difference also on the local ground. The other thing is in classical, let's say, Grundtvig programs, even the opportunity to have learners participating in mobilities, which is, I would say, it's daily agenda in the youth field and daily agenda as long as you are like in the higher education or vet field, but it's not such a common thing that people kind of have this learning mobility experience in the adult learning field, and that at the moment they are also much more focusing on staff mobility. And I think it's also a bit of a pity because a lot of promising initiatives have been taken up, which are super enriching for people. And then just for the sake of, because there needs to be saved some money or whatever, then they erase that from the main program. And this I find is a bit worrying because it also provides the opportunity for the European Union itself kind of to create paths for learners to bring their topics up to the European level. But if there is no programs that cater it, then it's very much like really to very, very diverse and very differently organized education and training systems in the adult learning field in the different states, where mobilities are probably not so much on the agenda, or only job related. And I think these two very promising initiatives they had, I think it would be super important to cater them further, because also like kind of how many European Union politicians regularly come into exchange with adult learners from whatever background. But you can say, and I see that like kind of having this kind of raising social inequality all over Europe, it becomes more and more challenge, which we should not end up with the adult learning field being the repair company like for failed social or industry policies or whatever.
Thank you very much, Georg, for joining me today and for sharing your insights. What you've just heard is the Enhance podcast, a series focused on learner voice, participation and inclusion in adult education. The Enhance project is co-funded by the European Union. If you're interested in learning more about Solidar's work on education and lifelong learning, you can find our social media in the episode description or visit solidar.org.